All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this week's installment of our West Midwest Azure Enablement Series. Today, we'll be talking about Azure File Migration. We have a full docket here, so we'll get started in a minute. And my name is Tom Fuchs, and I'm an Azure Infrastructure Technology Specialist here at Microsoft, and I will be presenting today. But before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. During a presentation, I wanted to make sure that we are interacting. There is a Q&A panel where you can submit your questions, and we will triage them as they come out. What you're looking at here is schedule for additional sessions. I'm going to cut and paste those into the panel just so you have the easy way to access those. So do come and check out these additional sessions that we'll be hosting. So with that, let me switch the presentations and we'll get started. So now you have in the Q&A panel the links to those registration events that I mentioned. All right, off we go. So today we'll be talking about the Azure Files. Azure has been maturing over the years, and obviously we are always expanding the capabilities. And so, hang on a second. And so we wanted to kind of keep you updated in terms of what is going on and what new options you have. Our agenda for today, let me turn off the transcription here. We'll take a look at Azure Files overview, talk about some technical details, AD integration, which oftentimes is a very pivotal part of the implementation for many of our customers because they're coming from that world and need to have ability to extend that paradigm into this new world. And then we'll talk about different migration options, and there are two that we'll be looking specifically. There's actually a plethora of other tools that you may be able to use, but we'll focus on that Azure File Sync and Azure Storage Mover to give you that. Then we'll share some parting thoughts, and we have some resources that we'll be sharing with you a bit later. So let's dive right in. So Azure Files is really a PaaS service for an Azure for a file server. Instead of running an IaaS VM in Azure, you deploy this Azure File Share, and you basically can have a repository in the cloud. This allows you to basically migrate applications that may rely on the file stores. There are many applications that write files, temporary storage, sometimes as part of their processing pipelines. And so figuring out how to leverage those once you move your application to the cloud is good. This way you don't have to be changing your application much or at all, as the case is with the AD integrated options. But we also have a number of customers that still have a lot of file shares out there that basically are just generic shares that are being used for storing information. As everybody knows already, right? SharePoint has a finite capacity, and that capacity isn't cheap. And there are a number of applications, number of industries and domains that frankly leverage those and will continue to do so because they generate tremendous amount of information. And so how do you get that? How do you leverage Azure Files to accomplish that migration is going to be key in making that application perform just as well before as well as after the move. So this is what we're going to focus on. Azure Files itself is actually a pretty robust service. We have many different features that today we're not going to talk about. In fact, today's presentation is really about Azure SMB files. There's NFS options that we're not going to touch on today, but we're going to cover all of the things that have to do with the SMB. And because Azure File Share is a PaaS service, right, there's no need for you to update those servers or these PaaS instances. It basically is done on your behalf. So it allows you to kind of reduce the maintenance in your environment. The security part of it, I mentioned Active Directory integration. This is all key to making sure that this all works. And Same SMB shares are supported by Linux and Windows clients. So those things are going to be options for you, regardless of what clients are accessing those. And in general, when we look at the different types of workloads, right, there's going to be kind of generic file shares. They're going to be file shares that are specific for applications. There's oftentimes Azure virtual desktop type files that are being deployed. But on the enterprise side, you also oftentimes will have SQL databases. Those databases can actually live on Azure file shares, which is tremendous. Gives you a lot of flexibility. And all of this is done in a way that gives you ability to tailor your service to your application's need, right? So performance, very key, and all of the things that we do, and we want to be very transparent about what you're getting with this. And of course, all these things ultimately, hopefully, lead to the success with your adoption of the cloud. So that really is kind of our ultimate goal, is to enable you to take advantage of these options to alleviate some of these assets from on-prem into the cloud. And oftentimes, the app migration really has to address all the different things that are being done on-prem, right? So that's why I've mentioned kind of a broader portfolio of things that Azure Files can do. Azure, is definitely, again, evolving all the time. So there's new things coming in. But as you're looking at your applications, trying to figure out how to minimize number of changes and how you can actually get that data into the cloud, that's really the core of what we're hoping you walk away from today's session. So next, let's take a look at the Azure Files, right? Azure Files really is this cloud service that gets created inside of Azure, and it enables you basically to access your file share as a PaaS service, just like you would with a UNC, Universal Naming Convention, for the network file share. The difference here is that your account, the storage account name, will come into play as the a way that you're addressing it. Now, there are options, and I've included some resources in the backup that allow you to abstract that name away, because oftentimes the types of names that you create for these storage accounts are not going to be your first choice. If you're following a naming convention, you may find that those are occupied, but there's a way for you to basically redirect from like a name that your users are used to be able to leverage the storage account with its existing name. Oftentimes, we recommend that customers think about like where you're going to be accessing these file shares from. Typical scenario is that you may have the file share and you may have virtual machines inside of Azure already. There you have an option of running older protocol SMB 2.1 as well as 3.0. You notice that when we go to the clients that are accessing it from the outside, Azure 2.1 is not supported. That protocol was super chatty, and that created a lot of headaches. And it was really the evolution of a protocol itself that allowed these shares to be directly accessible from the clients that are not inside of your cloud. And we'll talk about the file sync option here in a bit. Just know that is a way for you to get at your files as well. Earlier, I mentioned that there are a number of options that you have to how do you really integrate your existing infrastructure with Azure File Shares, the security that you may have imbued in your files, the ACLs that you may have applied. It's very key, in protecting that information. And of course, you have to have the infrastructure that supports it, right? So Active Directory domain services, and I'll show you when we create a storage account, gives you that option to basically maintain the kind of access you have today to your data, even after that data is moved to the cloud. So think about this, you can have a file share that today may be on-prem, but you move it, copy it, and we'll talk about means of moving them later on. You want to be able to access them, and that's exactly what this option provides you with. So it's the one that I've frankly seen the most thus far. There are two other options that I've seen less frequently: Microsoft Entra Domain Services, the old Azure AD Domain Services. Think of this service as the PaaS service for domain service inside of a cloud. It's a great solution if you have an environment that is pretty static, that perhaps doesn't have all the different applications, schema extensions, some other artifacts in it. it will provide you with that same ability to access those file shares, but you're no longer extending the domain naming context necessarily from on-prem, although you can sync your domain Active Directory from on-prem to Azure AD, and that in turn can synchronize with Entra domain services to give you that kind of ready-made environment for applying the ACLs and maintaining the security. So an option that you may need to consider in your case. And then the third option that is sort of representing, kind of where Microsoft is really thinking about how do we really enable these solutions to work well in the cloud, right? And Entra Kerberos for hybrid identities allows your users that have basically been able to see a domain controller at some point to be able to access these files. So on the subsequent shares, you no longer need to have a line of sight to a domain controller. The client presents the security token to the Azure File Share. Azure File Share will make a translation to Kerberos, proxy request for Kerberos ticket, return it to the client, and the client is able to access file shares just as they were before. So it is a neat option for more offline scenarios. I still find vast majority of my customers are really hosting most of their data within the confines of their Active Directory. And not often do you see anybody really exposing these things to the outside world. One other comment I want to make on this particular slide, all of the access that you have that's happening into the SMB shares happening over port 445, that by some, even though it is an internet-friendly protocol, was designed to do just that. It is sometimes blocked by many ISPs and companies, and this is why there's a need to kind of figure out how you might be able to get at these file shares, and that's why typical pattern is the use of VPN. And as we start looking at Azure File Shares, important part to consider here is, right, that all of the storage services that we have are usually tiered by the types of storage that you have. And as you kind of look at this graph right here, you're kind of looking at the least expensive, most performant on the left, and the least costly and least performant, but really meant for when it comes to cool storage, meant for archive type scenarios. So anytime you can move or utilize a lower tier of service, right, that is actually going to translate into cost savings. So with that, let's take a look at Azure Files demo. So here I have a pretty simple environment where I've built a number of machines. I've got basically 3 VMs, a domain controller, 2 file servers. I've also deployed the Azure File Sync that I'll be showing you later into the same tenant. We have a single VNet. We have a number of storage accounts that were also created, these 2 right here. And we have private endpoints that were dropped in. We have our Azure Private Link services that enable us to access those particular file shares through our internal network that lives in the VM. So in this context right here, I have my domain controller. And so in this domain controller, I have a number of things configured here. You can see my domain. Here you can see the Azure file shares. These objects here get created during the provisioning process that you go through to create Azure file shares integrated with Active Directory. I also have other computers that are just plain file servers in this environment that I'll be using for some of our demonstrations here. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the storage account. This is that same view that I was sharing here, right? And I'm going to basically go through a process of creating a storage account. There's a number of things that you need to pay heed to what's going on when you're creating it, because you want to make sure that you land with what you want. So my storage account, and we'll use today's date. And this is what I was talking about. All of these always have to be resolvable on a global scale, because this is how how Azure facilitates failover in case you needed to. And we have a couple options here. We can go with standard and premium. Premium can kick you up to something like on the order of 100,000 IOPS, which is insane amount of throughput, but you pay for that. with standard. Many of our customers are able to get what they need out of this. The thing to note too is when you select this non-premium storage, you have many more options that allows you for geo redundancy. You can have zone redundancy, local redundancy. When you go with premium, those options shrink, although there is now a preview service that is going to enable you to do some of the same things, but it's still coming. For purposes of our demo here today, I'm going to use standard with locally redundant storage. That means everything is still stored in triplicates. So this gives us a pretty good redundancy. And in fact, Microsoft has received some of the highest scores in terms of data persistence in all the environments, right? So it is something to pay attention to. Now, in here, you can see there's a couple of options, right, that you can look at. We're not going to enable hierarchical namespace. That's something that you need when you're using NFS and you're using data lake. For us, that's not required. We do have option here, and that's the one that I want to really call your attention to. By default, each file share is able to support up to 5 terabytes. With large file share support, we can actually bump that number to 100 terabytes, so pretty substantial chunk of data. I'm going to leave that on. I'm doing a cooking show here, so I'm going to abandon this. Whenever we work with these, we always want to disable public access, which will force you to create the private endpoint. I'm not going to do that here. Couple of other options that you need to be aware of, right? We have introduced storage immutability features to protect against the ransomware attacks, right? And this is all the different ways that you can basically protect your data, so your file shares cannot be deleted, and you can extend that as far as you need. You should be thinking about, what is my window of expected recovery? What is my window of detection when selecting all these? And so basically, this is all of the options that I wanted to share in this regard. Now let me switch over to show you what some of these options for the integration with Active Directory look like here in the UI. So this is my East US file server 1. I've created this in East US, that's hence the name. I've created 3 file shares. You can see that I've got hot, transaction optimized, and cool. Again, hot for very active workloads, transaction optimized, high IO, but maybe not as big as hot, and cool, obviously lower level of activity. And here's where we have our option to how do we integrate our services with Active Directory domain services and the other 2 options that I mentioned. This is already configured because it can sometimes take a few minutes for that to kick in, and I ran that before. In the resources slide, I included the link to the web page that describes all of the details of how you would actually perform this. I'm going to show this to you here in a minute. But the thing I wanted to call your attention to, we are on East US file server 1. By default, and these are share level permission, not the NTFS file ACLs. We're saying here that basically I want to disable access for anyone that is coming into these, even if they're authenticated. Now, if I selected the second option, then I can select that anybody that's authenticated by Entra ID can be considered storage SMB share contributor, elevated contributor, that's someone that can assign other people to that same role, and a reader that basically gives you a read access level at the share level. And you should note that all of these permissions here basically force you to explicitly provide access to these different file shares. So what I have here, I have, as I mentioned, I have 2 file shares. On that file share on that file share 1, we have on the file server 1, we have a single share 1 that's living under Z here. And as you can see, I am accessing this object. I generated 1,000 files. I get a gig worth of data there. I have other file shares, and what I wanted to call out to you, right, is that I'm able to access these file shares on file server 2 without really having to do anything else in accessing it. Now, this net use command is attempting to access file server 1 with share 2. And what I did want to show you here, and let me switch to this here, when I have my file share here, you notice that if I go to my access controls, right, I can view what types of access is granted to this resource. And you'll see that I have a number of users in my environment here All the gentlemen have contributor access. All the ladies have elevated contributor access. And the user account that I'm using here is Bob, or is it Bill? And that has access because I explicitly granted the access to that file share, even though I did not allow that access at the higher level through that option that I was just showing you inside of the Azure shared configuration, where you can say all authenticated users get access to it. So this is a way to ease it up. I did want to let you know that that does not change anything in terms of the ACLs. ACLs still operate access control lists like they used to, right? So if you go into look at the different file shares that are mapped here, all the drives will show up. You can see that I can actually go in and examine the security ACLs on this. And it's the same kind of ACLs that you would see if you had that file share running on-prem, right? So this is definitely what you would expect. Now, that feature that I mentioned to you, I do have an account that I was trying to use to access this. Now, Bill Smith is actually should be authorized, but because Share2 did not have this ACLs, it's prompting me for a password. I'm giving it a correct password, and I'm still getting access denied. So know that all the access controls that you typically have are still in place and very much enforced. With that, let me switch back to the presentation. And where are you here? There we go. All right, so let's keep moving here. So what are your options for migrating Azure Files migrating into Azure Files from the on-prem, right? As you might have guessed by looking at the demo I just shared, right, those file shares are directly accessible, and you can certainly copy stuff using any kind of copy tool. Even copy itself would work, RoboCopy, rich copy. There's many different flavors of utilities that you can utilize for that. But you also have option to utilize Azure File Sync. And Azure File Sync is actually an appropriate solution to be looking at whenever you're talking about servers, because that gives you ability to basically deploy the sync agent from your existing file share to protect your data, right? So this is all the different things that you really should be thinking about in terms of getting that data out there. Now, if you have a NAS device, like I'll show you in the demo, I have a NAS device sitting here on my home network. I could not install Azure File Sync on that device, and therefore I use the storage mover. So that kind of foreshadows the types of options you may have in terms of how you do get your data in there. So let's talk about Azure Files, right? So Azure File Sync. Azure File Sync really is a way for you to provide a local presence in your environment where you basically can have those servers move to the cloud, but you can still access the files locally, right? This is really a great way to provide a great level of service in a branch office where you don't necessarily manage and maintain them. And with Azure File Sync, you can allow Azure File Sync to manage the storage that's available, how the files get pulled, right? So it is a way for you to essentially give you that option of creating that good experience on premises with a file cache that represents really a copy of stuff that lives in Azure, which gives you some capabilities right out of the gate, right? So the thing to note here is that once you get your Azure file shares, and we're not really going to touch much on this today, but there's a lot of services that you should be thinking about. Now, Azure File Sync in itself will provide you with the ability to have multiple copies of the same data. You can distribute data to branch office, headquarters, make it accessible to users there, and that provides you basically a DR. You can also enable Azure Backup Vault to back up your data in the cloud, and that's the pattern that I see within many of our customers, where they're looking at how do they actually centralize their file shares and how do they ultimately back them up and protect them. So with this, you got a protected copy that lives in Azure, and the rest of the infrastructure that lives in the branch offices, maybe in areas that's not so super well maintained, is kind of considered secondary, because you will have access to the primary file share. For some of our customers, recommend that maybe if they have large files, that they stand up some AVD instances to allow them to access those file shares in the cloud. Again, you got to be on the SMB 3.1. but starting with Windows 7, that was always the case. So let's take a look at Azure File Sync and what that looks like. So back to my host here. And this is file server 1. I'm going to go to file server 2. And here I've got the same kind of experience I had elsewhere. I pre-downloaded this storage sync agent. There's one for each version of Windows. You should download the one that's appropriate for you. I'm running Windows Server 2022. So that's the version that I downloaded, and I'll show you real quick how you run through this. I'm not going to wait for it to complete and register agent. I'll show you the finished concept here. But the setup is super simple, right? This is intended to be a real, very, very easy to use tool. If you got proxies on your environment, you can configure those. You want to receive updates for the sync agent through updates. So if a new version comes up, it gets automatically updated, and you can tell it when is the best time for you to be doing this, right? So once I click install, right, it's going to go through this process. But I've already have completed this installation, so I'm just going to show you kind of what that looks like on the finished side. So here I've got my my resource group with all of my artifacts in it. And basically, when you install the Azure File Sync, you will have to go in and create a new resource. It stands up an endpoint in a cloud that then allows your service that you're accessing with Azure File Sync to talk to it through HTTPS, right? And that's really the big benefit of using Azure File Sync, because it's taking that other path in order to connect to these assets instead of trying to use SMB and legacy protocols. So here's my instance. When we look under registered servers, you'll see that I have one server that's registered. That's the server that I was showing you a minute ago. We've also created a sync group, and this sync group here has all the different properties defined on it. And when you're starting to look at this, right, you can now see basically how it creates a relationship between the share and the device here. So here you add the endpoints. That's where we're copying the data to. And certainly you have option to configure multiple servers to receive that data. Some of the interesting features that I want to encourage you all to kind of look at are around this cloud tiering. This cloud tiering is that auto management function. When you select this particular option, you see that you get enable free volume space policy. That really is what the cloud tiering is all about. So it starts moving files off of your file servers based on the which ones have been most recently accessed, and when you reach 20% or less of free space, it starts moving them out. You can also enable date policy that enables you to then start moving files that have been accessed for X amount of time, so it gives you some additional flexibility. And the other thing that is actually very cool is this enabling of proactive recall. This enabling of proactive recall will cause all the files that have been recently modified on a file share to sync to the replica, right? And that really does give you that option to really make sure that the files that you may be collaborating across the globe are available for you when you arrive to work, because your team offshore overnight made their updates, and those updates can basically be available to you. So you don't have to hit the file, download, which is the typical caching behavior for this. So a lot of interesting scenarios that can be lit up by this. So I really encourage you to take a look at this. And essentially, you know, my sync completed here. I copied a number of files from one file server to the other. The other thing I wanted to mention, since this file server has already been stood up and I'm replicating it, in here you can see that I've got my DFS management, distributed file system. You can see that I've created a file share, and notice that this file share actually has a Azure storage share and a true file server as two copies of that data. Today, these live in a single Active Directory site, which means client could be hitting one or the other. In a practical application, you typically would have your file server in your branch office, which would mean that that client would hit that server first and then potentially hit the Azure file share in Azure if that's not available. But this is an example of how you can integrate with DFS namespaces. DFSR won't work with this because you cannot enable DFSR role on an Azure file share construct. And so this is how you can really provide a very seamless migration path for your users. I also mentioned in the resources, I have a link to a page that describes how you can basically make any name that you want, pretty name. You don't even have to use DFS for this to abstract where users are accessing it. That allows you to swap things out. But this is really why DFS was created, because it does give you that flexibility to basically replicate the data whenever you need it, and then have that data exposed to the clients in a preferential, proximity first type paradigm. All right, let's continue on here. So we talked about Azure File Sync. The files themselves, once they sync up, they're just simply available there. Whenever a change occurs, those changes automatically propagate to the file sync, and so your data is always fresh wherever you go. The other option that I mentioned is that, oftentimes in enterprise environments, you also may need to migrate storage devices that don't have like a Windows head on them, and therefore you need something that's going to do this job using this different approach. And this is where Azure Storage Mover comes in. Azure Storage Mover is another hybrid service. It's important to understand that the communication as it happens between the storage mover agent and the NAS device happens over SMB. In our case, could be NFS, but the egress into the cloud that happens through port 443. And basically, you create a job, you identify an endpoint, register that endpoint with your storage mover, and then that endpoint is able to run these jobs as they kind of move through your environment. And so the important thing to know too, right, is that the storage mover agent does not actually communicate in an SMB. As I said, it's the data path here is what you see, right? But this right here becomes HTTPS traffic. So you really are using the standards that basically all of the clouds are running on. The management path just really represents what different things can be brought in through this service. So some of the things that this can do, and the reason I'm bringing it up is because it really is meant to help you achieve a larger scale migration. You can plan out a migration of an entire application that perhaps may be spanning multiple geographies where the data has to be synced up from all of the relevant sources to make this a success. So with Azure Storage Mover, you basically have an option of creating multiple agents, deploying multiple agents, and then allowing those agents to execute a migration job concurrently so that you can have essentially, a parallel path that executes and gets all of your data into your environment. And this kind of shows you a little bit about how the storage mover itself functions, right? So we create the storage mover object inside of Azure that then allows us to download the agent that I'll show you here in a second that I downloaded to my Hyper-V. I couldn't put it on Azure because it is a Hyper-V OVA type model. And I don't have a Hyper-V running on my hosts. I could, but not supported, so I don't want to confuse folks. But the idea here is that multiple storage mover agents can run jobs across the geography, and that really gives you ability to really run the migration worldwide if you got a really large application. So with that, let's take a look at Azure Storage Mover. So let's see. I'm going to switch to my other tenant here. And so here's my storage mover resource that was created. I have that registered agent that I mentioned. This is the on-prem agent. I'll show you here in a second. Storage endpoints basically indicates locations where I'm copying data from. Source endpoints, target endpoints is where it lands. And I've already ran this job, right? When we look at it from a project explorer, this is where you start kind of seeing how this can actually accomplish. You can have, multiple agents that can move multiple points. What we're looking at is the job that I ran when I initially copied my music file share into Azure. It all copied 35 gigs in something like looks like a couple of hours, right? But it's really all dependent on number of resources and things that you may deploy in support of that. And that's another differentiator for Storage Mover, because you're not eating the resources that are required for running the OS. It's less disruptive. So if your file server is on its last legs and you do have another place to deploy a VM into, perhaps that might be a better choice for you in order to get your migration completed. And let's get to our Storage Mover. So here you're seeing another server here in my office. I got this Storage Mover agent that I've downloaded as part of onboarding process. I have to log into the appliance, and probably should change that password, but I'm really looking at just a proof of concept environment. Here I wanted to call out a couple of things. This is a great way to test to see how successful it is. You can see that it's reaching out to some storage accounts, file share accounts, just to make sure that the firewall is all good. But you also notice that there's some other resources here. I can't really use my cursor, but somewhere in the middle of that, you can see that it's talking to Azure Arc. And this is exactly how it's intended to be, because Azure Arc is what allows us to basically assign the managed identity to the object that we have created. So my agent here, if I go to Arc, you'll see that under machines, I have this agent. This is the same agent that I was just showing you a minute ago. We're running a latest version of Ubuntu. The other resources that I was mentioning are part of this is the Key Vault. And the Key Vault requires that you store the credentials for those endpoints in here. So I've got secrets here, right? Those secrets represent my logon username and password. And those secrets basically are fetched by an agent at runtime. So anytime you need to update it, you make a change centrally and you're good to go. But the thing I wanted to point out is that we had to grant that managed identity ability to retrieve these particular services. And so here you can see my on-prem agent is a reader of these Key Vault secrets, and that allows it to basically retrieve that information and retrieve the keys and complete the job. Let's see. So for the Storage Mover itself, we already looked at the project there. So I think that's all that I wanted to show you in this regard here. Let's move on. All right. So in terms of where to use what, right? This is the part that I wanted to share with you, right? This is really kind of the driving force behind mentioning Azure Storage Mover, its ability to move data in the lift and shift migration scenarios across the globe in multiple file shares from a single resource to orchestrate these migrations and scale. Azure File Sync, I think, is a phenomenal type of resource that you could use for basically providing you that evergreen file share that synchronizes to the cloud, where you can back it up, and basically all of your information is going to be sent to those servers on premises. And if that server dies, maybe you have a small hypervisor footprint, you can simply recreate it and reblast the content right back down to your file servers. There's no need for you to be repeating the process, right? It knows already that is their replacement, and it'll copy that data back to you. So when you're considering these, know that there is multiple tools for you guys to leverage, and certainly there's a lot of collateral published around these. In the resources slide that I'll share here in a second, there's tons of content in here that you can basically leverage for this. I'm going to paste these resources into our chat window, so you have access to these right now. And get this going here. So please feel free to register for the events that I pasted before and check out these links that I shared that give you more information, basically all the moving steps that you have in order to go through this process. Let me see if there's any questions. So there's a question here, and yes, Azure File Sync agent and storage mover will download the entire VM, right? That's the portion that you can create here. Let's see if we go back into my storage mover. In here, you have an option to basically download, and it takes you to a page where you download the file that you need. You can see that there's the OVA and Hyper-V VHDX. So this is how you get these files all stood up. If I'm not mistaken, that may be the only question that I see here. So one other thing I did want to share with the team, this would not be a Microsoft presentation in 2024 if I failed to mention Copilot. So I do have it enabled. I do actually have most of the stuff that's today in my Microsoft non-production tenant. You see this little icon here, right? That indicates that I have access to Copilot. And when you come into, this is my subscription, and let's say that I had some questions that I wanted to ask, right? This is where Copilot kicks in. So for example, I can ask it very simple question: how many resource groups in my subscription? And so you'll see that it's kind of thinking about it. It sees the context that I'm introducing this all in, and it's going to generate a response. It's interesting because the responses are never the same. They oftentimes are similar, but I'm yet to get exact replica. I know that can be a bit frustrating. I have a lot of colleagues that work with the Azure OpenAI, and that's certainly an artifact of it. But the power to really grasp the context of the question is just so immense that you really need to be thinking about that. So as you can see, it gave me two options here. I can go to Azure Graph. I can run the query in here. And in fact, it's going to produce exactly what I have. If I wanted to do this in PowerShell, can you give me a PowerShell script to do the same? It'll generate it, right? I have Azure, I have GitHub Copilot as well. But when you're working in a context of your subscription, right, it's nice to have this helper that is really looking exactly at everything that you are. And it's giving you the answers that are specific to your context as you're looking here. And you can see here that it gave me additional commands, although it looks like it generated some CLI, not PowerShell, but it's a similar concept, right? So let's see, it actually thinks that I did not ask for PowerShell. I probably should have just left it as PowerShell, but you get the point. So this is something else. And as an additional bonus on the resource list, right, this last link I have in there is a place where you can sign up for Azure Copilot for basically a free trial. So if this is something that you do for a living, I highly encourage you to really think about all this. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. As I mentioned earlier in our session, right, we have our upcoming sessions. I pasted these links into the chat, so please register for those. If you're interested in Azure OpenAI, the session with Hannah, she's one of our CSAs, is going to be great. That's coming up in about 2 weeks. So please consider registering. And with that, I want to say thank you. Thanks for attending. And if there's any other questions, I'm going to stay on here and monitor the chat. Let me know. There's a question about, can these resources be deployed using ARM templates? Everything in Azure ultimately does land in that sort of a template, right? So the answer is yes. Let's see. There's a question about migrating reference links. I'm not sure if those work. There's a series of limitations, right? But to the second part of the question, you can create a CNAME alias. You can use DFS, and then those are available. I showed them to you in the resources slide. There's a section in there where you can, where it actually explains exactly how you can provide this. Actually, it's, I'm just gonna share this screen here, just point this out so it's clear. Right, so it's this third resource on my page here. It talks about accessing Azure Files with multiple forests, but it does talk about setting the SPN that allows you to abstract the name. And so those will be, again, good resources if you're starting to move this. So yeah, DFS, I showed that earlier on. That does allow you to do all these things, and so you can abstract it away so users don't actually know where their data lives. In fact, you could be moving it and they may not catch on to much later. I don't have any templates here on hand, but let me see if I can maybe locate some, and I will share those out appropriately. But with that, I think that's all that we have, and that's all the questions. So thank you all for attending. Appreciate everyone being here today. And please do come and check out our future shows. Thank you so much.